We don't serve his kind here. Leave, now. Before I have to call somebody.
If he walks out that door, this table's mine now, Roland.
You'd risk your job for a stranger you don't even know?
I don't need to know your name to know you deserve a hot meal.
She had $11 in her apron and a daughter waiting for her at home, and she still chose to risk her job rather than turn a hungry man away. What she did not know, standing there with a coffee pot in her hand and her manager's eyes burning into the side of her face, was that the man she had just chosen to defend had been testing her for 6 weeks. Every visit, every quiet Tuesday, had been leading to this exact moment, though she had no way of knowing it yet. She thought she was simply doing what her mother raised her to do. She had no idea she was about to find out who he really was, or what his family's history with this diner already had to do with her. Her name was Deja Marsh, and this is her story. It is a story about a diner off a two-lane highway in Georgia, about a manager who thought kindness was a weakness, and about a stranger who walked through that door looking like the last person anyone would want to serve. But there are 3 questions I need you to hold on to as we go, because the answers are going to surprise you. Who was this man really, and why had he been coming back to this same diner, week after week, always sitting in the same booth? Why did Deja's manager, a man named Roland Pike, hate him on sight before the stranger had said a single word? And what did this diner have to do with a woman named Ruby, a woman none of them had ever met, but whose name was about to change everything? Before we go any further, I want to be honest with you. I do not know your name, but I know that a story like this only exists because somebody like you stays to hear it. Please subscribe, like, and share this with someone who could use a good story tonight. And if you have a moment, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from. Your city, your country, whatever you are comfortable sharing. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Thank you for staying. Because I should warn you now, this story does not end the way you think it does. There is something she does not know about him, and by the time you find out, you will understand why I had to tell it. Deja Marsh was 29 years old, and she had been working at the Blue Magnolia diner for almost 4 years. It was not the job she had planned for herself. Back in high school, she had wanted to study nursing, to work in a hospital, to build something with letters after her name. But life has a way of rearranging plans, and hers had rearranged the day she found out she was going to be a mother. Her daughter's name was Aaliyah, and she was 7 years old, all elbows and questions, the kind of child who noticed everything and forgot nothing. Deja raised her alone, in a small rented house on the edge of town, and every double shift she picked up at the diner was, in her mind, a brick laid toward a better life for that little girl. The Blue Magnolia sat on a stretch of highway that had once been busy, back when the interstate ran differently, back when truckers and travelers filled every booth from breakfast to close. Now it survived mostly on regulars, on the same faces every morning, on the kind of quiet loyalty that keeps a small business alive long after the world has moved on. The diner had been in the Pike family for 2 generations. Roland Pike, the current manager, had inherited both the restaurant and his father's way of running it, which was to say, with a rigid sense of who belonged and who did not. Roland was in his 40s, always in a pressed white shirt, always watching the room like it might slip out of his control at any moment. There are people who lead with fear because they were raised to believe that respect and fear were the same thing, and Roland was one of them. His father, Walter Pike, had run the Blue Magnolia before him, and Walter had built his reputation on exactly the kind of judgment his son inherited. Walter decided who was welcome at his counter and who was not, and he had never once been asked to answer for it. Roland grew up watching his father turn people away for the way they dressed, the way they spoke, the vehicles they arrived in. He absorbed it the way children absorb everything, without questioning whether it was right, only understanding that this was how a man protected what was his. Deja had learned, over 4 years, exactly how to survive under a manager like Roland. She kept her head down. She worked hard. She smiled at customers even on the mornings her feet ached and her patience was thin. She had bills that did not care how she felt, and a daughter who needed shoes that fit. And so she did what so many people do. She made herself small enough to keep the paycheck coming. But there was one thing about Deja that 4 years of surviving had not managed to erase. And that was her belief that everyone who walked through that door deserved to be treated like a person first and a customer second. It was a belief her own mother had raised her on, and it would end up costing her more than she ever expected. It was on a rain-soaked Tuesday in early spring that a man walked into the Blue Magnolia who would change the direction of every life connected to that diner. He came in calmly, shaking the rain from a heavy navy coat, taking the same booth near the back window that he always seemed to prefer. His head was shaved close, his hands were rough in the way that comes from decades of real work, and his motorcycle sat parked outside, dripping under the awning. His name, though almost nobody at the diner knew it yet, was Marcus Wynn, and this was not his first time coming in. In fact, it was his 6th Tuesday in a row. Nobody at the Blue Magnolia paid much attention to the pattern at first, but Deja had noticed it. Every Tuesday, around the same hour, the same broad-shouldered biker would walk in, order black coffee, and whatever the daily special happened to be, and sit by that back window for almost 2 hours, saying very little, watching the room more than eating. Some of the other staff found it unsettling. Tanya Ford, who had waited tables alongside Deja for nearly as long as either of them could remember, joked more than once that the man gave her a strange feeling, like he was studying the place rather than simply visiting it. Deja never felt that way. She thought he looked tired and guarded, and like a man carrying something heavy that he had no intention of setting down in front of strangers. Roland felt differently, and he felt it from the very first week. There was something about Marcus Wynn that put him on edge in a way he could not fully explain, even to himself. Maybe it was the heavy coat he always wore, rain or shine. Maybe it was the way Marcus never rushed, never seemed to care whether the staff liked him or not, sitting there with the quiet patience of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and nothing left to prove. Roland had grown up hearing his father talk about men like this, men on motorcycles who showed up looking rough around the edges, men his father always assumed were trouble before they had done a single thing to earn that assumption. Roland had absorbed the assumption along with everything else, and by the 6th Tuesday, his patience had run out completely. That morning, the rain had been coming down since sunrise, turning the gravel lot outside into a shallow river. Marcus walked in soaked to the shoulders, rain still running down the collar of his coat, and took his usual booth without a word. Deja was already moving toward him with a menu and a fresh pot of coffee when Roland stepped out from behind the register, planted himself in the middle of the floor, and said the words loud enough for half the diner to hear. He told Marcus that this was a family establishment, that they had a certain kind of clientele to think about, and that men who looked like him were not the image the Blue Magnolia wanted to project. He told him, plainly, to leave. The diner went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone realizes they are about to witness something they will remember. Forks stopped moving. A mother at a nearby table pulled her son a little closer. Tanya froze near the kitchen doorway, order pad still in her hand. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply looked at Roland for a long moment, the kind of look that carries more weight than any shouted word could, and began to gather himself to leave, the way a man does when he has been asked to leave rooms before and has learned there is no dignity in fighting it. And it was in that exact moment, watching a man prepare to walk back out into the rain over a plate of eggs he had not even ordered yet, that Deja Marsh made the decision that would upend everything. She set the coffee pot down on his table. She told Roland, in front of every customer still watching, that she would be taking this table herself, and that if he had a problem with that, he could take it up with her after her shift. It was not defiance for the sake of defiance. It was not even entirely a decision, in the way decisions are supposed to be weighed and considered. It was closer to instinct, the same instinct that told her to check on Aaliyah when she coughed at night, the same instinct passed down from a mother who had taught her that turning away a hungry person was not something you did, no matter who was standing behind you giving the order. Roland's face went the color of old brick. He told her, quietly enough that only she could hear, that she had better think very carefully about what she was doing. She thought about it. She thought about her rent, due soon. She thought about Aaliyah's growing feet and the shoes that would need replacing before summer. She thought about 4 years of keeping her head down precisely so that moments like this one would never have to happen to her. And then she poured the coffee anyway, and took Marcus Wynn's order, and treated him with the same warmth she gave every regular who had ever sat in that booth. Marcus watched her the entire time with an expression she could not quite place, something between gratitude and reserved calculation, as though he were confirming something he had already suspected for 5 Tuesdays before this one. If you're still with me, thank you for staying this long. Drop a comment and let me know, would you have done what Deja did? The days after that Tuesday were not kind to Deja. Roland did not fire her outright, not immediately, but he made his displeasure known in every smaller way available to a man in his position. Her hours were cut without explanation. She was moved off the better shifts, the ones with steady tips, and placed instead on the slow mid-afternoon stretch when the diner emptied out and the money dried up along with it. Tanya noticed the shift immediately and began covering for Deja without drawing attention to it where she could, trading shifts, slipping her extra tables when Roland wasn't watching closely enough to object. It was a small kindness, but in a workplace that had suddenly turned cold, it mattered more than Tanya probably realized. There was one night, about 10 days into the cold treatment, when Deja sat at her kitchen table long after Aaliyah had fallen asleep, staring at a stack of bills that no longer added up the way they used to, and let herself think seriously about walking away first, before Roland could force her out on his terms instead of her own. She had a cousin in Macon who kept telling her there was work at a warehouse there, steadier hours, no manager standing over her measuring her worth by how she treated strangers. She almost called that night. What stopped her, in the end, was not courage exactly. It was smaller than that. It was Aaliyah's shoes sitting by the door, a size too small already, bought with money Deja had earned by staying exactly who she was. She put the phone down and went to bed instead, and in the morning she put her apron back on, because leaving would have meant Roland was right about what kindness cost, and some part of her was not ready to let him be right about anything. Aaliyah did not know the details of what was happening at the diner, only that her mother had started coming home quieter than usual, and that some nights she caught Deja staring at the stack of mail on the counter for longer than reading it should take. One evening, while Deja was going through bills at the kitchen table, Aaliyah climbed into the chair across from her, set down a drawing she had made at school, and asked, in the direct way only a 7-year-old can manage, whether her mother was going to lose her job for being nice to somebody. Deja did not know how much Aaliyah had picked up from overheard phone calls or her own private observations, but she did not lie to her. She told her daughter that sometimes doing the right thing costs you something, and that it was still the right thing to do anyway, and that she would rather Aaliyah grow up watching her mother choose kindness and struggle for it than watch her choose comfort and feel small inside it. Aaliyah considered this with the seriousness only children bring to conversations adults think are over their heads, and then she slid her drawing across the table, a crayon picture of the diner with a big yellow sun over it, and told her mother that she had drawn it because Deja always said the sun still comes up even on bad days. Deja kept that drawing taped inside her kitchen cabinet for years afterward, long after everything else about that season of her life had changed. Roland did not stop at cutting her hours. 2 weeks after the rainy Tuesday, he called Deja into the small back office that had once belonged to his father, sat her down across a desk cluttered with invoices, and slid a written warning across the surface for her to sign. It cited 3 infractions, each one technically true and entirely manufactured in spirit: a late clock-in that had been 4 minutes and forgiven a dozen times before for other staff, a customer complaint that had never actually been filed, and an accusation of insubordination that rested entirely on the coffee pot she had set down weeks earlier. Deja read it twice, her hands steady even as her stomach was not, and asked him plainly whether this was about her work or about that Tuesday. Roland did not answer the question. He only told her to sign it. She did, because refusing would have given him exactly the insubordination he was already inventing, but she asked for a copy, and something in the way she asked told Roland this was not a woman who would simply disappear quietly if he pushed hard enough. What Roland did not know was that Tanya had been standing just outside the office door when he called Deja in, and had discreetly taken a photograph of the write-up sitting on the desk before the meeting even started, the date and Roland's signature clearly visible. She did not tell Deja right away. She simply kept it, tucked away in her phone, the way a person keeps an umbrella they hope they will never need. It was a small act, and a risky one, since a manager who would invent infractions for one employee would not think twice about inventing them for another. But Tanya had grown up watching her own mother get pushed out of 2 jobs by men exactly like Roland, and she had promised herself a long time ago that if she ever had the chance to make sure it did not happen again in front of her, she would take it. That night, after the diner had closed and the last regular had gone home, Roland sat alone at the counter and called his father. Walter Pike had retired to a small house 2 counties over, and he still answered the phone the way he had always run his diner, certain of himself before he had heard a single detail. When Roland described the man in the heavy coat, half expecting his father to tell him he had done the right thing, Walter only laughed, a short, satisfied sound, and told his son that some things never change no matter how soft the world tries to get. It should have felt like validation. Instead, sitting there in an empty diner with a written warning still sitting in his desk drawer that he knew, somewhere underneath his own certainty, he had built out of nothing, Roland felt something he did not have a name for yet, and would not find the name for until Marcus Wynn sat across from him weeks later and said it plainly. Word of what happened at the Blue Magnolia spread the way it always does in a small town, faster than anyone intended and twisted a little more with every retelling. Some versions had Deja shouting at her manager. Some had Roland threatening to call the police on a man who had done nothing but sit there minding his own business. What almost nobody in town knew was that Marcus Wynn had continued coming back every single Tuesday, sitting in that same booth, always served now by Deja, and only Deja, since none of the other staff dared cross Roland twice in one season. Nobody knew his last name. Nobody knew where he lived, what he had done for a living, or why a man on a motorcycle seemed to have unlimited Tuesdays free to spend 2 quiet hours in a diner on the edge of town. Then came Elijah Cross. He arrived one afternoon, driving a black car that looked entirely out of place in that gravel lot, and he walked in asking a few careful questions about a man who matched Marcus's description. He did not explain himself to the staff, only asked when Marcus usually came in and whether anyone knew where he stayed. Tanya, rattled, told Deja she was certain now that something was wrong, that the biker was mixed up in something dangerous, maybe running from something, maybe involved in something the rest of them had no business getting close to. The whispers in the kitchen grew louder. Some of the staff began to wonder aloud whether Deja had made a terrible mistake standing up for a stranger who might not deserve defending at all. Not everyone in town was willing to let the rumors stand unanswered. Among the regulars who had been coming to the Blue Magnolia for decades was an older man named Mr. Gaines, a retired mechanic who had eaten breakfast at the same counter stool every single morning since before Roland was born, and who had watched Marcus Wynn from a distance for weeks with mild curiosity rather than suspicion. When he overheard 2 other customers speculating loudly that Deja had put the whole diner at risk over a stranger who was probably dangerous, Mr. Gaines set his coffee down harder than he meant to and told them, in a voice that carried the whole length of the counter, that he had known Deja Marsh since she was in pigtails bringing her mother's church casseroles around the neighborhood, and that a girl raised right does not stop being raised right just because a manager gets nervous. It was not a big moment. Nobody filmed it, nobody posted about it. But word of what Mr. Gaines said traveled through the regulars almost as fast as the original rumors had, and by the end of that week, the whispers in the diner had quietly split into 2 camps instead of one. What Deja never knew, and would not learn until much later, was how close Marcus had come to ending the test himself before it ever reached its conclusion. Elijah reported back to him after each visit, small details mostly, how Deja looked more tired some weeks than others, how the other staff had started keeping their distance from her table. When Elijah told him about the written warning Roland had forced her to sign, Marcus sat with the news for a long time in the back of his car outside a diner 2 towns over, turning his phone over in his hands, seriously considering walking back in that same afternoon and ending it. He had built his entire test around watching people at their most unguarded, but he had never intended for it to cost someone their livelihood, and for the first time since he had started visiting his diners this way, he questioned whether the answer was worth what it might take from the person giving it. What stopped him? In the end, Marcus rose from the booth slowly, the way he always did, unhurried, and this time he did not simply thank Deja and leave the way he had every Tuesday before. He asked her to sit down for a moment, if she had a minute to spare. She glanced toward the kitchen, toward Roland's office door, and decided, not for the first time, that some moments were worth whatever came after. She sat. He told her his full name was Marcus Wynn, and that 6 months earlier, He had purchased the small restaurant group that owned the Blue Magnolia, along with 4 other diners scattered across 3 counties. He told her that he did not buy businesses to sit behind a desk and read reports about them. He bought them, and then he visited them himself, dressed exactly as he had dressed every one of those 6 Tuesdays, because he wanted to see with his own eyes how his employees treated the people the world had taught them to overlook. He had done this at every diner he owned. Most of them had failed the test in small, forgettable ways. The Blue Magnolia was the first place where the test had nearly cost someone their job. But there was more, and this was the part that made Deja's hands go still in her lap. Marcus told her that decades earlier, his own mother had worked at this very diner. Her name was Ruby Wynn, and she had waited these same tables back when Roland's father, Walter Pike, still ran the counter with the same rigid judgment his son had inherited. Marcus told her what happened to Ruby the way his mother had told it to him, more times than he could count, at a kitchen table that never quite stopped feeling like it happened yesterday. Ruby had been working a Sunday rush when a black trucker, tired and hungry after 2 days on the road, sat down at the counter and asked for a plate of eggs. Walter Pike had walked over, looked the man up and down, and told Ruby in front of the whole counter that she knew better than to seat his kind there. Ruby served him anyway, quietly, the same way Deja would decades later, and Walter fired her before the man had even finished his coffee. No severance, no final paycheck for the week already worked, just a folded apron pushed back across the counter and a door held open behind her. Ruby walked home in the rain that day with 3 children waiting for her and no job to go back to, and she never once told young Marcus to hate the diner for it. She only ever told him that the world would try to make him believe kindness was foolish and that he should never let it convince him. Watching the weight of that single unfair morning follow his mother for the rest of her life shaped Marcus more than almost anything else in his childhood. When Ruby passed, he made himself a quiet promise that if he ever had the means, he would find out what kind of place the Blue Magnolia had become since that day, and he would make sure no one else walked out of it carrying what his mother had carried for so long. He told Deja that when he first sat down in that back booth all those weeks earlier, he expected almost nothing. He had watched his own history nearly repeat itself in Roland's face the first week, in the way the young manager sized him up and found him wanting before a single word was exchanged. What he had not expected was Deja. He had watched her, week after week, treat him with the same steady decency regardless of who was watching, and then he had watched her risk her own paycheck to defend a stranger the moment it actually cost her something to do so. That, he told her, was the only test that had ever mattered to him. Not whether his staff were polite to a well-dressed customer, but whether they would still choose decency when decency came with a price attached. Before we get to how this story ends, if it's reached you tonight the way it reached me, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. The days that followed moved faster than Deja could have imagined. Marcus returned the following week, no longer in the heavy coat he always wore to the diner, but in the plain, unremarkable clothes of a man who simply preferred not to be noticed, and he asked to speak with Roland directly. What was said in that office stayed largely between the two of them, but Roland emerged from it pale and quiet, and within the month, his position as manager of the Blue Magnolia had ended. It was not framed as revenge, and Marcus was careful to make sure Roland understood that. It was simply that a man who had inherited his father's judgment along with his father's diner was not the kind of steward Marcus intended to keep in charge of a place that carried his mother's name in every hidden corner of its history. Walter Pike heard about his son's removal within a day, the way news like that always finds its way home, and he drove to the Blue Magnolia himself the following morning, still certain enough in his own righteousness that he expected to walk in and fix whatever misunderstanding had cost his son his position. He found Marcus behind the counter instead, going over inventory sheets with Deja, and demanded to know who exactly had the authority to remove a Pike from a diner his own family had built. Marcus set the sheets down slowly, looked at the old man for a long moment, and told him his name, then told him his mother's name, and watched something behind Walter's eyes falter for the first time in what was likely decades. Walter did not apologize, not really, not in the way that would have made a clean story of it. He said only that he remembered Ruby, that she had been a good worker, as though that settled something. Marcus told him that being a good worker had never been the question, and that he had not driven 2 counties to hear an old man defend himself, only to see, with his own eyes, whether the diner his mother had been thrown out of had learned anything at all in 50 years. Walter left without another word, and he did not come back. Roland, who had been standing near the kitchen door through all of it, watched his father walk out for what would be the last time either of them set foot in the Blue Magnolia together, and something in his face suggested he understood, perhaps for the first time, exactly what his father had cost him without ever once explaining why. Deja was offered the position instead, general manager of the Blue Magnolia, with the kind of salary and benefits she had once believed belonged only to people whose lives had gone according to plan. She said yes before Marcus had even finished the offer, and then she went home and cried at her kitchen table, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes after years of holding something too heavy for too long. Aaliyah, 7 years old and endlessly observant, asked her mother why she was crying if nothing bad had happened, and Deja told her the truth, that sometimes the good things catch you even more off guard than the bad ones ever could. Marcus made one more change before he considered the matter settled. In the back corner of the diner, near the window where he had sat for 6 quiet Tuesdays, a small brass plate now hangs beside the booth, engraved simply with a name and 2 dates. Ruby Wynn. It is not explained to most customers who ask, and Deja has never felt the need to explain it either. She simply knows, every time she walks past it, that the diner she now runs exists because a woman named Ruby was once turned away from it, and because, years later, a stranger in a rain-soaked coat decided to find out whether anyone still remembered what that kind of unfairness costs a person. Marcus did not forget what Tanya had done either. He never mentioned the photograph directly, not wanting to put her in a position of having to explain how she came to have it. But when Deja became general manager, one of her first acts, at Marcus's gentle suggestion, was to promote Tanya to assistant manager, with a raise that finally let her stop working the second job she had never once complained about in front of anyone. On the day the brass plate for Ruby Wynn was mounted beside the back booth, Mr. Gaines was there, in his usual stool at the counter, and he was the first customer to ask Deja who it was for. When she told him, he sat with it for a long moment, nodded slowly, and said only that some debts take longer to pay than others, but the good ones always come due eventually. Then he ordered his eggs, the same way he had every morning for 30 years, and the diner went on the way diners do, carrying its history in its walls for anyone who cared enough to ask. I think about this story more than almost any other I have told you, because it is not really a story about a biker, or a diner, or even about the man who owned it. It is a story about the moment before we know we are being watched, the moment when kindness either costs us something, or it does not really count as kindness at all. Deja Marsh did not know she was being tested. She only knew that a soaked stranger was being told to leave a place that had never once turned her own family away, and she decided that was not going to happen while she still had a coffee pot in her hand. I have to ask you the same question I have been asking myself since I first came across this story. If you had been the one standing there, coffee pot in hand, manager watching, would you have poured it anyway? If this one stayed with you, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and I'll see you in the next story.